A single dad helped an elderly woman for months. Then the CEO who fired him called her mom. What really connects these people? And why would that single moment change everything you think you know? Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here for another heartfelt story filled with emotion, resilience, and unexpected turns. If you enjoy meaningful stories that stay with you long after they end, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for your continued support. Your time, kindness, and encouragement mean more than you know. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what would you do if one unexpected connection changed the way you saw someone forever? Now, let's begin this remarkable story from the very first moment. You don't belong here, the sharply dressed executive said, his voice echoing across the polished marble foyer. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. And for one unforgettable heartbeat, a little girl reached for her father's hand instead of hiding behind him. Daniel Carter tightened his grip on Emma's small fingers, but said nothing. At 39, he had learned that dignity often sounded quieter than anger. His faded blue work shirt still carried the smell of fresh lumber from the construction site he had left only an hour earlier. His boots were clean enough for an interview, though years of hard work had left permanent scratches across the leather. Emma looked up at him with worried eyes. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" she whispered. Daniel forced a gentle smile. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes people decide who you are before they know your name." The receptionist shifted uncomfortably behind the front desk, unsure whether to intervene. Employees walking through the lobby slowed their pace, pretending to check their phones while secretly watching the scene unfold. The executive folded his arms. "Security will escort you out if you don't leave." Daniel reached into his pocket, slowly pulled out an envelope, and looked at it for a long second before lowering his hand again. "We were already leaving," he replied calmly. There was no anger in his voice. That somehow made the silence even heavier. Emma glanced around the enormous building, her backpack hanging from one shoulder. She had spent the afternoon quietly coloring in the waiting area while her father attended what he believed would be a meeting about his future. Instead, it had become the shortest conversation of his career. As they stepped outside, cold autumn air replaced the artificial chill of the glass tower. The city moved around them without slowing down. Yellow taxis rolled past. A bus hissed to a stop across the street. Office workers hurried toward restaurants before the dinner rush. Life continued as if nothing had happened. Daniel looked at the folded letter in his hand. His position had been eliminated. No warning. No second chance. Just a signature at the bottom of the page and a polite reminder to return his company badge. Emma quietly slipped her small hand into his again. "We'll be okay, right?" she asked. Daniel looked at his daughter, then toward the glowing skyline beginning to reflect the colors of sunset. He wanted to promise everything would be fine. Instead, he chose something he knew was true. "We'll keep doing the right thing. That's always worth something." Emma nodded as if that answer was enough. Maybe, for tonight, it was. Neither of them noticed an elderly woman struggling to lift several grocery bags near the edge of the parking lot. Neither of them knew that a simple act of kindness, offered without expecting anything in return, would quietly begin changing every life connected to that towering building behind them. Daniel and Emma walked the 3 blocks to their apartment without saying much. The evening air had turned colder, and the orange glow of the streetlights slowly replaced the fading sunlight. Emma finally broke the silence. "Do you think they will call you back?" Daniel looked ahead before answering. "No, I think today was the end of that chapter." She lowered her eyes for a moment. "I liked when you worked there. You always smiled when you came home." Daniel smiled softly. "Then I guess I need to find another place worth smiling about." Their apartment was small but spotless. Every book was neatly arranged. Every dish was washed before bedtime. Emma placed her backpack beside the kitchen table while Daniel quietly opened the refrigerator. There was enough food for a few more days if they were careful. He reached for a carton of milk, checked the date, and poured 2 glasses. Emma noticed him staring at a stack of unpaid bills on the counter before he gently turned them face down. He never wanted her carrying worries that belonged to adults. After dinner, Emma spread her homework across the table. Daniel sat beside her, helping with a math worksheet even though his own thoughts kept drifting back to the meeting. He remembered the executive barely looking up from the file before saying the company was moving in a different direction. Years of loyalty had disappeared in less than 5 minutes. There had been no argument, no chance to explain, only a polite goodbye wrapped in corporate language. Emma finished the last problem and looked up. Dad, yes. Are you scared? Daniel paused longer than usual. He believed children deserved honesty, but not hopelessness. A little, he admitted. Being brave does not mean you never feel scared. It means you keep going anyway. Emma nodded and quietly hugged him. That simple hug somehow carried more comfort than any words either of them could have found. The next morning, Daniel woke before sunrise, updated his resume, and began searching for work. He called contractors, repair companies, and local businesses. Most conversations ended with the same answer. They were not hiring. By noon, he had already heard the word no more times than he wanted to count. Still, he thanked every person who answered the phone. Late that afternoon, he picked Emma up from school. As they walked home, they passed a neighborhood grocery store where an elderly woman stood beside the entrance, trying to steady a shopping cart, while several heavy paper bags leaned dangerously to one side. A few shoppers glanced at her before continuing toward their cars. Daniel slowed his pace. Emma noticed it immediately. She looked up at her father and smiled because she already knew what he was thinking. Without saying a word, he handed Emma his backpack, stepped toward the woman, and politely asked, "Ma'am, would you like a hand carrying those home?" The elderly woman looked into his eyes with quiet surprise, as though kindness from a stranger had become something she no longer expected. The elderly woman smiled with quiet relief. "That is very kind of you," she said. "These bags always seem lighter when I fill them and twice as heavy when I leave." Daniel chuckled softly. "That sounds about right." He lifted the grocery bags with practiced ease while Emma carefully folded the shopping cart and walked beside the woman. They crossed 2 quiet streets lined with maple trees whose leaves drifted gently onto the sidewalks. The neighborhood was peaceful, filled with brick homes that had clearly stood for generations. Nothing about the walk felt extraordinary, yet there was an unexpected warmth in the easy conversation. "My name is Margaret Bennett," the woman said, "and this young lady must be your daughter." Emma smiled politely. "I am Emma." Margaret looked at her with gentle eyes. "You have wonderful manners." Emma glanced toward her father. "He taught me that helping people is free." Daniel smiled, but looked slightly embarrassed. "She gives me more credit than I deserve." Margaret laughed, the sound soft enough to match the quiet afternoon. When they reached her house, Daniel stopped for a brief moment. The home was beautiful, but showed signs that one person had been trying to maintain it alone. The front porch railing leaned slightly. Several flower beds needed attention. One porch light hung crooked above the front door. Margaret noticed him looking around. "My late husband used to fix everything himself," she said. "I still catch myself expecting to hear his toolbox every Saturday morning." Daniel lowered the grocery bags onto the kitchen counter after she unlocked the door. The house felt warm, filled with family photographs, old books, and the comforting smell of fresh cinnamon. It did not feel lonely. It felt as though it was patiently waiting for laughter to return. Margaret reached for her purse. "Please let me pay you for your help." Daniel gently shook his head. "No, ma'am. We were already walking this way." "Then at least let me give your daughter some cookies." Emma looked at her father before answering. He nodded once. "Thank you," Emma said with a smile. Margaret disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a small tin filled with homemade oatmeal cookies. "These are my husband's favorite recipe," she said quietly. Emma accepted one, took a careful bite, and her eyes widened. "These are amazing." Margaret laughed again. "That is exactly what my husband used to say." Daniel noticed the loose porch railing again as they prepared to leave. "If you do not mind," he said, "I could come by one afternoon and fix that for you. It should not take long." Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "You would do that?" "It is safer that way," Daniel replied simply. "And I have the tools." She hesitated before smiling with grateful eyes. "I would like that very much." As Daniel and Emma walked home carrying only an empty backpack and a tin of cookies, Emma looked up at him. "Dad, you did not even ask her for anything." Daniel looked toward the quiet street ahead. Kindness works best when it does not expect a reward. Neither of them realized that someone inside a parked black sedan across the street had quietly watched the entire visit, making a brief phone call before driving away without revealing who they were. 3 days later, Daniel returned with a toolbox balanced in one hand and a small paper bag of fresh muffins that Emma had insisted on bringing. Margaret opened the front door before they even reached the porch. "I was beginning to think I imagined meeting the two of you," she said with a warm smile. Emma held out the bag. "These are blueberry. Dad says you should never visit someone empty-handed." Margaret accepted the gift with obvious delight. "Then your father was raised well." Daniel spent the next hour repairing the loose railing, tightening several worn hinges, and replacing a cracked porch step that had become a tripping hazard. None of the jobs were complicated, but together they made the old house feel cared for again. Margaret watched from the porch swing with a cup of tea. "You notice things most people walk right past," she said. Daniel wiped his hands with a clean cloth. "When you work with buildings long enough, you learn small problems become expensive ones if nobody pays attention." She nodded thoughtfully. "That is true for people too." The words lingered in the quiet afternoon. Emma wandered through the small garden, carefully watering flowers with a green watering can she found beside the shed. Butterflies drifted between blooming roses while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the yard. It felt peaceful in a way their busy apartment building never did. When the work was finished, Daniel packed his tools. Margaret reached for her checkbook again. "Please let me pay you this time." Daniel smiled politely and closed the toolbox. "I cannot accept money for helping a neighbor." She looked almost frustrated. "Then at least have dinner with me." Emma looked hopefully toward her father. He hesitated before nodding. "We would be honored." That evening the three of them shared homemade chicken soup, warm bread, and stories that somehow made the hours disappear. Margaret spoke about traveling across America with her late husband in an old station wagon. Daniel shared funny memories of Emma learning to ride her bicycle without training wheels. Emma laughed as she reminded him that he had been more nervous than she was. The house, once quiet, slowly filled with laughter again. Before leaving, Margaret handed Emma a small framed photograph. It showed a young couple standing beside the very same front porch decades earlier. "That was the happiest summer of my life," she said softly. "Keep it for a little while. I think every picture deserves someone willing to smile at it." Emma carefully accepted the frame as though it were priceless. Outside, the evening sky glowed with soft shades of orange and purple. As Daniel loaded his toolbox into the trunk of his aging sedan, he noticed the same black luxury car parked half a block away. It had been there during their last visit as well. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. For a brief moment, the engine started. Then, just as quietly, the vehicle pulled away into traffic. Daniel watched until it disappeared around the corner, unaware that someone had been observing every visit with growing curiosity instead of suspicion. The weeks slipped by almost unnoticed, and helping Margaret slowly became part of Daniel and Emma's routine. Every Saturday morning they stopped by her house before running errands or filling out another round of job applications. Sometimes Daniel repaired a loose cabinet door. Other times he raked leaves, cleaned gutters, or replaced burned-out light bulbs that Margaret could no longer safely reach. Emma often baked simple muffins with ingredients they already had at home, insisting that every visit deserved something homemade. Margaret always greeted them with fresh coffee for Daniel, warm cocoa for Emma, and stories that somehow made the old house feel alive again. "Your father reminds me of someone," Margaret said one afternoon as Emma helped organize family photographs across the dining room table. "Who?" Emma asked. Margaret smiled gently. "Someone who believed that character is measured by what you do when nobody is watching." Emma looked proudly toward her father, who was quietly repairing an old rocking chair near the fireplace. Daniel pretended not to hear the conversation, but a small smile appeared anyway. Money remained tight. Daniel accepted occasional repair jobs from neighbors, fixed broken fences, assembled furniture, and painted garages whenever work became available. Some weeks were better than others, yet he never complained in front of Emma. Every evening they sat together at the kitchen table, sharing dinner and talking about the best part of their day before homework began. It was a tradition that cost nothing but meant everything. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Daniel received another rejection after interviewing with a construction company. The hiring manager apologized politely and explained that another applicant had more recent commercial experience. Daniel thanked him anyway and walked back toward the parking lot beneath a gray umbrella. His phone buzzed. It was Margaret. "Would you mind stopping by when you have time?" she asked. "Nothing urgent. I simply have a question." Daniel smiled despite the disappointing day. "We will be there this afternoon." When he arrived with Emma after school, Margaret greeted them with an old wooden box resting on the living room coffee table. Inside were dozens of faded photographs, handwritten letters, and newspaper clippings collected over many decades. "I have been meaning to organize these," she admitted. "But every memory seems to lead to another one." Emma carefully picked up a black and white photograph of a smiling young woman standing beside an elegant office building. "Is this you?" Margaret nodded. Many years ago, Daniel noticed something unusual in the background of the photograph. The company logo engraved above the entrance looked strangely familiar. Before he could study it more closely, Margaret gently returned the picture to the box. "Some memories deserve their proper time," she said softly. At that exact moment, a luxury sedan slowed across the street. The driver remained inside for only a few seconds before pulling away once again. This time, however, Daniel caught a brief glimpse through the windshield. It was a professionally dressed woman speaking into a hands-free headset while quietly watching Margaret's front porch, as though she was trying to understand why two strangers had become such an important part of an elderly woman's life. The woman inside the luxury sedan was Victoria Bennett, and for the third time that month, she found herself parked across the street from her mother's house instead of driving directly to another meeting. Her assistant's voice came through the hands-free system. "Your board members are waiting." Victoria glanced toward the front porch where Daniel was helping Emma carry an old planter while Margaret laughed at something Emma had just said. "Reschedule the meeting for tomorrow morning," Victoria replied quietly. "Tell them something unexpected came up." She ended the call and remained where she was. It was not suspicion that had brought her there anymore. It was confusion. Her mother had spent the past 2 years refusing offers from private caregivers, contractors, and expensive home maintenance services. Yet she welcomed this unemployed carpenter and his daughter into her life as though they had always belonged there. Victoria had asked several neighbors about Daniel. Every answer sounded almost identical. He worked hard. He never overcharged. He always finished what he promised. He was raising his daughter alone. No one had a single dishonest story to tell. That unsettled her more than anything else. She had spent years leading a major corporation where everyone wanted something. Favors usually came with expectations. Generosity often arrived with invoices. Yet every report about Daniel ended the same way. He simply helped people. Across the yard, Margaret noticed the familiar sedan again. She smiled knowingly, but said nothing. Instead, she poured fresh lemonade into 3 glasses and invited Daniel and Emma to sit beneath the shade of an old oak tree. "Emma," she asked gently, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" Emma thought for a moment before answering. "Someone my dad would be proud of." Daniel looked away toward the garden, pretending to admire the flowers while quietly blinking back unexpected emotion. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over Emma's. "I believe you already are." The afternoon passed with simple conversations and quiet laughter. Daniel repaired a squeaking garden gate while Emma helped Margaret label old family photographs. One picture slipped from the stack and landed face up on the table. This time Daniel saw it clearly. The elegant office building was unmistakable. It was the headquarters where he had lost his job only weeks earlier. Before he could ask about it, Margaret calmly placed the photograph back into the wooden box. "There will be time for that story," she said with a gentle smile. "Just not today." Daniel respected the answer and asked nothing more. As the sun began to set, he packed his toolbox. Emma hugged Margaret before climbing into the car. From across the street, Victoria watched the goodbye through her windshield. There was no performance, no request for money, no attempt to impress anyone, only genuine affection that could not be purchased. For the first time in many years, Victoria found herself questioning not Daniel's intentions, but her own assumptions. She started the engine, looked once more toward her mother's front porch, and quietly whispered to herself, "Who are you, Daniel Carter?" The answer, she realized, might change far more than she expected. The following Saturday began like every other, but nothing about it would end the same way. Daniel and Emma arrived carrying a small apple pie they had baked together the night before. Margaret welcomed them with the familiar warmth that had become part of all their lives. "I have been waiting for you," she said with a smile that seemed brighter than usual. "I have something important to tell you." Before anyone could sit down, the sound of another car pulling into the driveway echoed outside. Daniel glanced through the front window and recognized the same dark luxury sedan. This time, however, it did not remain across the street. It stopped directly in front of the house. A professionally dressed woman stepped out, carrying no briefcase, no phone, and none of the hurried confidence Daniel had imagined someone in such an expensive car would have. She walked slowly toward the front porch, almost as if she was unsure whether she belonged there. Margaret's expression softened immediately. "Perfect timing," she whispered. Emma looked between the two women with quiet curiosity. The front door opened before the visitor had a chance to knock. "Victoria," Margaret said warmly. "Come inside." Daniel politely stepped back to make room. Victoria paused as she noticed him standing in the hallway with Emma beside him. For a brief second, neither adult spoke. She had imagined this meeting many times, but reality felt strangely different. Daniel simply offered a courteous smile. "Good afternoon." Victoria nodded politely. "Good afternoon." Margaret looked at all three of them before taking a slow breath. "I believe it is finally time that everyone knows the truth." She motioned toward the living room, where the old wooden box still rested on the coffee table. Emma quietly sat beside Margaret while Daniel remained standing, unsure whether he should leave. "Please stay," Margaret said gently. "This story belongs to all of us now." She opened the wooden box and carefully removed the same black and white photograph Daniel had noticed days earlier. This time she handed it directly to him. Daniel studied the picture. The young woman smiling confidently beside the office building was unmistakably Margaret decades earlier. Above the entrance was the same company logo he had passed every morning before losing his job. Margaret smiled as she watched recognition slowly appear across his face. "Yes," she said softly. "That building has been part of my family's life for a very long time." Victoria quietly lowered her eyes. "My father founded that company," she admitted. "When he passed away, my mother inherited his shares. Years later, I became chief executive officer." Daniel looked from the photograph to Victoria, then back toward Margaret. Suddenly, every unanswered question from the past several weeks began fitting together. The familiar logo, the expensive sedan, the careful observation from across the street. The silence in the room grew almost overwhelming. Victoria finally met his eyes. "I have watched you help my mother for months," she said honestly. "You never asked who she was. You never asked for money. You never asked for anything." Daniel answered with the same calm dignity that had guided him since the day he lost his job. "She was simply someone who needed a little help." Victoria swallowed quietly, her voice softer than before. "Then I need to tell you something that I should have known long before today." Just as she prepared to continue, the front doorbell rang once again, and the familiar voice that had dismissed Daniel weeks earlier echoed from the front porch, asking if the chief executive officer had arrived. Victoria walked to the front door and opened it without hesitation. The executive standing on the porch immediately straightened his posture. His confidence faded the instant he noticed Daniel inside the house. He recognized him at once. "I did not realize you were here," he said awkwardly. Daniel simply nodded. "Neither did I." Margaret invited the executive inside, and an uneasy silence settled over the living room. Emma quietly moved closer to her father, sensing that something important was about to happen. Victoria closed the door behind them and looked directly at the executive. "Do you know this man?" she asked. "Yes," he admitted. "He worked for us until the restructuring." Victoria's expression remained calm. "Tell me exactly what happened." The executive cleared his throat. "His position was eliminated as part of our cost reduction plan." Victoria did not look away. "That was not my question." He hesitated before answering more honestly. "I believed he was no longer a good fit for the direction of the company." Margaret quietly folded her hands. "Did you ever speak with him before making that decision?" The executive lowered his eyes. "No." Victoria turned toward Daniel. "How long were you with the company?" "Almost 11 years, Daniel replied. "Did anyone ever question your work?" "Not that I know of." Victoria looked toward the executive once more. "Did his performance reviews show any serious concerns?" The room fell silent. Finally, the executive answered in a barely audible voice. "No." Victoria took a slow breath. "Then you dismissed a loyal employee without even taking the time to know him." Nobody spoke. The weight of those words filled the room more completely than anger ever could. After several long seconds, the executive turned toward Daniel. His voice had completely changed. "I owe you an apology. I judged you too quickly. I believed I understood your value after only a few minutes. I was wrong." Daniel listened without interrupting. Emma looked up at her father, waiting for his response. He remained calm, exactly as he had been on the day he walked out of the office. "Thank you for saying that," Daniel answered. "We all make decisions we wish we could change." Margaret smiled quietly. Victoria stepped closer. "There is something else you should know," she said. "Over the past several weeks I spoke with your former coworkers, your neighbors, and people you have helped. Every conversation described the same man. Honest, reliable, respectful. The kind of person every company hopes to find." Daniel seemed genuinely surprised. "You investigated me?" Victoria smiled for the first time. "I wanted to understand why my mother trusted you so completely." Margaret reached over and gently squeezed Daniel's hand. "Trust is earned through ordinary moments repeated over time." Victoria nodded. "Exactly." She reached into her briefcase and placed a folder on the coffee table. "I cannot change what happened, but I can take responsibility for what happens next. I would like to offer you your position back with full seniority, restored benefits, and a leadership role in our community facilities improvement program. The decision is yours. No pressure, no deadline today." Daniel looked at the unopened folder before looking toward Emma. She smiled with quiet hope, but did not say a word. He took a slow breath, knowing that whatever answer he gave next would shape not only his future, but the future of everyone now sitting together in Margaret's living room. Daniel looked at the folder for several quiet seconds before finally opening it. He carefully read every page without rushing. When he finished, he closed the folder and smiled politely. "I appreciate this opportunity more than you know," he said. "But before I answer, there is something that matters even more to me." Victoria listened without interrupting. "Respect cannot begin on the day someone discovers your value," Daniel continued. "It has to become part of how people are treated every single day, especially the ones nobody notices." The room remained silent. Even the executive who had once dismissed him lowered his eyes again. Victoria nodded slowly. "You are right." She turned toward the executive. "Beginning Monday, every department head will personally review our employee development policies and workplace culture. We have spent too much time measuring numbers and not enough time recognizing people." The executive accepted the responsibility without argument. "I understand." Daniel smiled gently. "If those changes truly happen, then I would be honored to come back and help build that kind of workplace." Victoria extended her hand. "Then welcome back." Daniel shook it with quiet confidence rather than excitement. Emma clapped softly before wrapping both arms around her father. Margaret laughed through grateful tears. "Now that," she said, "is exactly the ending your father would have hoped to see." Several weeks later, Daniel returned to the company, but his role looked very different. In addition to leading facilities improvement projects, he worked directly with new employees, teaching apprentices that craftsmanship was not only about buildings, but also about character. He was respected not because of his title, but because every person who met him quickly realized he listened before speaking and helped before asking for recognition. Emma loved visiting the office after school. The same lobby where she had once held her father's hand in uncertainty now welcomed them with warm smiles from employees who knew their story. The receptionist greeted her by name every Friday afternoon. Even the executive who had once judged Daniel always stopped to ask how school was going. His apology had become more than words. It had become consistent actions. Margaret continued hosting Saturday dinners, insisting that no family should wait for holidays to share a meal. Victoria attended whenever her schedule allowed, leaving her business phone inside her car so she could simply be a daughter again. The old wooden box remained on the coffee table, but now new photographs slowly filled its empty spaces. There were pictures of Emma planting flowers beside Margaret, Daniel repairing the porch one final time, and an entire group laughing together beneath the old oak tree. One autumn afternoon, Emma carefully placed a new framed photograph into the box. It showed everyone standing together on the front porch, smiling beneath golden leaves. Margaret looked at the picture for a long moment before quietly saying, "Families do not always begin the same way. Sometimes they are built one act of kindness at a time." Daniel looked around the porch that had first brought them together and realized that losing one job had unexpectedly led him to people who would remain part of his life forever. The company regained an exceptional employee. Victoria regained precious time with her mother. Margaret found laughter in her home again. Emma discovered that kindness really could change lives. And the greatest reward Daniel ever received was never the new position, the restored career, or the Respect that followed. It was the quiet certainty that choosing dignity over bitterness had written a far better ending than anger ever could.